Welcome everyone, and thank you for watching this Song Connections event as part of the Oxford Lieder Festival. My name is Natasha Loges. Few composers had as deep a sense of history as Brahms. This talk explores that lifelong fascination which was expressed through his love of early choral repertoire, his choice of song texts, and the books and scores in his private library. My thanks to James Atkinson and Anna Manastireanu from the Royal College of Music for their performances. And please remember that at the end of this event, I'll be joining you live to answer any questions you may have. Just email songconnections@oxfordleader.co.uk or tweet with the hashtag OLF2020. And on that note, let's start with some music. Brahms's Vergangen ist mir Glück und Heil. I think that song is a brilliant example of the musical time traveling that Brahms undertook, and I hope you found it a little bit strange. It's a hybrid sound world. That voice and piano combination is quintessentially 19th century, but the modal harmonies and above all, that text of unrequited love takes us straight back into an imagined past world of courtly love in the Middle Ages. Austere, sparsely populated, and perhaps even a little bit unreasoning. This is not the Renaissance world of great named artists, nor the Romantic world which celebrated individual subjectivity. This is an anonymous world of the medieval altarpiece, the stark woodcut, or the illuminated manuscript. We might think of the Manesse Codex, which is held in Heidelberg Library, a 14th century collection of Middle High German Minnesang poetry that was enormously inspirational to Brahms's generation, especially to writers who he knew personally and admired, such as Gottfried Keller. This anthologizes poems by a mixture of figures who are historical, who we know existed, or semi-mythical, or about whom so little is known that they may as well be mythical. And some of those names might be familiar to you, such as Tannhäuser. And it's significant that the first critical edition of the Codex appeared in the early 19th century. I think it is also significant that the Codex was finally bought by the Bibliotheca Palatina in Heidelberg from the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris in 1888. So this is during Brahms's lifetime, by public subscription, which was headed by Wilhelm I, Emperor of Prussia, and Otto von Bismarck, who was one of Brahms's great heroes. Here in the Codex, you can see Walter von der Vogelweide musing over his page. And here is Count Kraft von Toggenburg in a typical depiction of courtly love. Certainly, the fascination with the past in general was a larger trend, which was energetically fostered by figures whom Brahms deeply respected, like Felix Mendelssohn, who altered people's perception of the value of old music. But although plenty of others shared in this enthusiasm, Brahms was a little different. Firstly, this work was personally meaningful and important to him. Brahms had no formal advanced training as a musician. The first conservatories were only established in Germany in 1843, when he was already 10 years old, and he couldn't have afforded them in any case. And unlike his great mentor, Robert Schumann, he couldn't consider university study either. His formal education came to an end when he was 14 years old. So if he was to connect with the social class, which would enable him to become the kind of composer he wanted to be, it was essential that he took charge of his own cultural and historical education. Now, this all sounds terribly joyless, but there was great pleasure involved in this work. Brahms was curious, he was hungry for knowledge, and everything was grist to his mill. After meeting the Schumanns when he was 20 years old, he spent the next 4 years glorying in their extraordinary library in Düsseldorf, even against the backdrop of Schumann's mental illness and eventual death in the middle of that period. But even before he met the Schumanns, he had already developed the habit of hand copying scores and melodies which interested him from printed and manuscript sources. At that point, he couldn't afford to buy those scores or have copies commissioned. Far be it for me to romanticize poverty, but I think there may have been an advantage to working like this. Copying internalizes lines and contours and harmonies much more deeply than simply reading off a page. Once Brahms was wealthier, he stopped making hand copies and he just bought the books, and I do wonder if he got as much out of them that way. He was also a passionate rummager in second-hand bookshops, a man after my own heart, so he bought many cheap publications of early music in editions of varying quality, as well as hundreds of other books. Now, I have to confess to a historical approximation. The definition of early music for Brahms's generation stretched from Renaissance music to Bach, and included figures like Johannes Eckart, Michael Praetorius, and Heinrich Schütz. This is, of course, not medieval music. But Brahms's interest in early literature certainly included medievalism, so I hope I'm not playing too fast and loose with my title today. Brahms's most overt commitment to literary medievalism is demonstrated by his devotion to the poetry of courtly love, to which he repeatedly returned. He wasn't alone in this. Poets also mined that material for inspiration and brought it to the public in modern guises, and composers, of course, responded to this. One very famous example is the poem which Grieg set as Der verschwiegene Nachtigall. This was a medieval poem by Walter von der Vogelweide, translated by Brahms's publisher's uncle, Karl Simrock, who was a literary scholar. And you can see the first verse here. Unter den Linden an der Heide, wo ich mit meinem Trauten saß, da mögt ihr finden, wie wir beide die Blumen brachen und das Gras. Vor dem Wald mit süßem Schall, Tandaradai, sang im Tal die Nachtigall. And Brahms took a real risk with this devotion to the poetry of courtly love when he composed 15 romances based on the Provençal story of Count Peter and Magalone, which he published as his Opus 33. The poems were by the writer Ludwig Tieck, who was fascinated with early popular literature and a distinguished translator. Brahms's songs are enormous. The tale is convoluted, and it is no easy experience for a singer, pianist, or indeed an audience to follow the musical and literary twists and turns of this huge song cycle. In Brahms's day, people most often selected just a few of the romances to perform in concert, and the most popular of those was this lullaby, Ruhe süß Liebchen, so this is what we will hear now. The medieval sound world is abandoned. Brahms connects with the past through text, but draws it into the present through his music. For someone who lived his life wisely and sensibly, Brahms loved escaping into fictional worlds, and the library he collected by the time he was already 20 years old included many traces of Germany's medieval past. This was a glorified period of history, replete with castles and princesses and knights, and there were nationalist undertones to this interest, which we also shouldn't ignore. But he also collected other literature, such as translations of Sanskrit sagas, Persian verse, and much more. Brahms was a natural collector, and his friends recognized this by giving him books as presents, new editions and anthologies which reflected his interests. He also chose his friends with care, building warm and lasting relationships with librarians, our best friends, I'd suggest. And one of these was Gustav Nottebohm, who introduced him to what is the collection of the Nationalbibliothek in Vienna, a treasure trove of scores and literature. Brahms collected from the past in two different ways, on the printed page and on the concert stage, and I'll talk about both of these. First, collecting on the page. Brahms's library is preserved in the archive of the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde in Vienna, which is one of the most magical places I've ever had the pleasure of visiting. This is where we can see his mammoth collection of books, scores, and hand-copied melodies. But collecting was not just about contemplation for Brahms, it was about assimilation. His copies of scores are extraordinary documents. He annotated them liberally, writing in references and cross-references, making corrections, identifying melodies that he knew from other sources, and spotting points of music theoretical interest like chorales, bass lines, imitations, parallels, and dissonances. It is as though he took that music into himself and made himself entirely one with it. And this allowed him to turn it into compositional inspiration. And he played compositional games, for example, shifting bar lines to see how the prosody of a text would be affected. Without wanting to get too technical, Brahms is rhythmically one of the most innovative of composers, always inviting us to take an anarchic view of the bar line and shift an emphasis elsewhere, playfully, confusingly, even subversively wrong-footing us. And this is something he learned, at least in part, from his work with early music. But when it came to collecting through concerts, Brahms was less successful because he simply asked for too much from his audience. For a short period in 1863, he was director of the Singakademie in Vienna. The first concert that he put on included some Bach and some Isaac, alongside Beethoven, Schumann, and some of his own folk song arrangements. But the second included Rovetta's Salve Regina and music by Eckhard, Schütz, and Gabrieli. Apart from the fact that the performers simply didn't know what to do with this music, audiences found it too severe. In that sense, it was up to Brahms to help his listeners forge that connection across time, and he did that through his own music. I want to concentrate now on his arrangements of folk songs with piano accompaniment. As with early music, with which the category of folk song definitely overlaps, Brahms initially copied by hand, and those manuscripts are preserved so we can see how widely he arranged all across Europe from Sweden to Bohemia. But again, connection, not just across time in this case, but across geographical space, was central. Brahms's sophisticated listeners would want enough musical interest and richness to draw them repeatedly to this music, not just to look at it as a historical abstraction. I've chosen two examples for you today, Es ritt ein Ritter and Es steht ein Lind, which he arranged. In the first song, you might hear how the bass line in the chorus of the song is offset, bouncing off the weakest beat of the bar, and also how Brahms included unexpected, almost wrong-sounding notes to titillate the ear and make us sit up. Our story is a very familiar one, a medieval one of a knight and a princess. She flees with him and then regrets her decision as they enter a forest, and he tethers his horse and is himself despondent. We aren't actually told what happens, but just as the song seems to start mid-phrase, we're given, as it were, a rough block of a story, seemingly hewn out of a larger structure as opposed to a polished narrative, and we certainly get no happy ending. I chose Es steht ein Lind as our second example because we can imagine it following on from this scenario. Again, listen to that austere, rhythmically ambiguous opening and to those heartbreaking words in which our lover draws on everything which surrounds them, a lime tree, a bird, a stream, to help them lament the loss of their love.
Es ringt ein Ritter wohl durch das Ritterfing, es an ein neues Lied, gar schöne Täter singen, das Wort und Talent klingen. Das hört des Königs sein Töchterlein, in ihres Vaters Lustkämmerlein. Sie flocht ihr Haar in Seiden, mit dem Ritter wollt sie reiten. Und da sie in den Wald rauskamen, viel heiße Tränen sie fallen ließ. Schaut ihr wohl unter die Augen, warum weinet ihr schöne Jungfrauen? Warum sollte ich nicht weinen? Ich bin ja des Königs sein Töchterlein. Hätt ich meinem Vater gefolgt, Frau Kaiserin, werd ich worden. Nahm sein Rösslein wohl bei den Zaun und band es an einen Weidenbaum. Hier schrieb ein Rösslein und trinke, mein jungfrisch Herz muss sinken. Es steht ein Lind in jenem Tal, ach Gott, was tut sie da? Sie will mir helfen trauern, trauern.
Music like this opens up all sorts of interpretative questions. Do we sing this music like folk song? There is a famous recording of Lucia Popp and Geoffrey Parsons performing Es steht ein Lind, in which she presents it almost like a Wagnerian aria. But for me, this music is immensely versatile, responding to the most untrained voice, but equally able to withstand a powerful professional instrument, which is why I think these songs are still sung in concerts today. But it does raise for us this question of ownership. When Brahms reached out across time and brought that music into wider use in his own day, he not only made it his own, but he gave it to everyone who had a little music literacy and time and the love of song to enjoy in turn. In this, his acts recall someone else who was centrally important to him, Martin Luther, who was born at the tail end of the medieval era. Luther's chorales and his translation of the Bible into German, which was published in the 1530s, were also an act of connection, of giving, of facilitating shared ownership, transforming culture in the same way that King James's Bible would embed itself permanently into the English language when it appeared 80 years later. Luther's hymns were part of Brahms's musical inheritance, and while he himself had an ambivalent and questioning attitude to established religion, he never questioned the importance of singing and church music. I imagine that many listeners could sympathize with that approach. Collections of chorales burgeoned in Brahms's day, both as a subject of scholarly study and as a source of musical material, and Brahms integrated those lines into many of his works. But again, he made a more immediate connection when he set his 4 serious songs, his 4 ernstige Gesänge, right at the end of his life. In fact, he wasn't that old. He was just in his mid-60s, but he was dying of the liver cancer that had killed his father before him. The songs set 4 Lutheran translations, not in an austere chorale style, but in the developed, complex language of art song, again transporting those words from one context into another and building a new connection. Let's listen to one of those now, O Tod, the third in the set.
O Tod, O Tod.
I am normally very cautious with the word timeless, but that contemplation of the injustice of life and the resultant ambivalence towards death does feel timeless to me. In recent months, its relevance has felt stronger than ever. So Brahms's engagement with the past, whether medieval or inching into the Renaissance, whether in text or in sound, was alive. It was growing continuously. It was nourished by an insatiable curiosity and a desire above all to connect with his musicians and with his listeners. Let's end with a song which exemplifies all that. Brahms's Minnelied was composed in 1877 when the composer was famous, established and prosperous, but he was still attracted to the poetry of courtly love, of Minne, the lover imploring his beloved lady never to leave him. This is poetry which would have transported him right back to his childhood. The poem itself symbolizes a series of connections. Its topic is medieval, certainly, but the words were believed to be by the late 18th century Anacreontic poet Ludwig Hölty, who died tragically young. In fact, they were by his colleague, Johann Heinrich Voss, who passed them off as Hölty's when he edited the poems in the early 19th century, and so they came into Brahms's hands. Brahms, in turn, again enjoyed a bit of time traveling in the song, setting it to a gentle, lilting triple time, but constantly playing with the pulse of the song so that we always share our knightly lover's unease, but then rewarding us with that distinctly unmedieval delight, a terrific high note, a glorious climactic moment right at the end. Thank you for listening.
Dieser